He's not dying from illness, he's being murdered. The most feared mafia boss in the city is surrounded by doctors, machines, and men with guns, yet nobody can explain why his body is shutting down, because this was never a medical emergency. It was betrayal, carefully hidden inside the one place he thought was untouchable. And the only person who sees it is the woman everyone in the room ignored the moment she walked in.
That last surgeon didn't set down his tools because the job was finished. He walked away because every drop of hope had dried up. 67 stories above the frozen winds of Chicago, in a palace worth more than a dozen lifetimes, the life of Santino Castellano was slowly hemorrhaging. His heart wasn't simply stopping, it was being commanded to surrender. 15 of the world's most expensive medical minds hovered over the bed, their $800 an hour hands quivering like terrified interns on their first day. Dr. Helena Cross, a woman who once pulled a president back from the brink in a moving aircraft, couldn't find a steady rhythm. Beside her, the legendary Rajan Mehta stared at the vitals as if they were written in a dead, ancient language. Beyond the sterile curtains, 400 soldiers lurked in the shadows. They all knew the heavy price. If the king dies, the city of Chicago goes up in flames. Killian Castellano, a man whose only language was a gold-plated pistol and a hair-trigger temper, whispered his final ultimatum. "You have 8 minutes. My brother burned $60 million on this floor and another $15 million just to keep you experts on speed dial. If he doesn't wake up, none of you take the lift down. You'll be leaving through the glass." But the miracle didn't come from a laboratory or a high-tech machine. It didn't come from a man in a white coat. It came from Jolene Hadley, a 27-year-old delivery driver and single mother, barely keeping her head above water. She arrived at 2 a.m. with bags of premium steaks for a private order, a kitchen she didn't realize was owned by the very empire that was currently collapsing upstairs. A $500 tip was the only light on her cracked phone. In her beat-up truck, 4-year-old Rosie slept, clutching a ruined teddy bear named Mr. Boots. Jolene wasn't a guest, but near the pillow she caught a scent that the million-dollar censors had missed, a smell the professionals didn't even have a name for. She knew that odor instantly. It was the smell of her father's South Side cellar before he vanished without a word 4 years back. This wasn't a medical tragedy, it was a cold-blooded execution. And the killer responsible was still breathing the same filtered air inside that very tower. If this chilling tale has your pulse racing, lean in and tap that like button to join our circle. Share this with a fellow mystery lover and subscribe right now. You won't want to be left in the dark for the chapters coming next. Up in that sky-high mausoleum, the most dangerous man in the Midwest was a second away from the darkness. The only hope was a woman the elite had deemed invisible. Beneath her feet, the polished marble mirrored the monitor's cold blue glow, turning the suite into a silent foyer for the afterlife. Heavy velvet curtains choked out the city lights, cutting the room off from the living world. The sharp burn of antiseptic fought with the heavy, expensive perfume, creating a thick atmosphere where every breath tasted of silver spoons and impending rot. Santo lay gray and motionless, his eyelids locked tight, yet his left hand was performing a miracle of horror. His fingers weren't just twitching, they were moving with a haunting, rhythmic cadence, as though his nerves were playing a slow funeral song on a phantom piano. Ignoring the hand, Dr. Cross focused on the screen, where the pulse was a dying ripple. She gripped a 15-centimeter needle, the final, desperate prayer designed to pierce the chest and kickstart the muscle back to life. This was the final act, the hammer of death. It either wakes the soul or seals the lid. As she moved to strike, Mehta caught her arm. His voice was low, heavy with the weight of someone who understood the heart's secret whispers to the brain. "Look at his fingers, Helena. That is no oxygen-starved spasm. It is a perfect rhythmic cycle every 3 seconds. This isn't a heart giving up on its own. It is a brain actively commanding the body to stop breathing. Cross snapped back that the blood work was spotless, with no poison in sight. With only 2 minutes left, the clock was a scream in their ears. Maida fired back, asking what happens when you force a heart to beat when its own mind is begging for the end. You won't save him. You will just break him. He will die by our mistakes, and that blood will be on us forever. The room fell into a heavy silence. 13 other doctors watched the standoff, trapped between two legends while the underworld king slipped away between them. In this house, a slip-up meant a bullet, not a lawsuit. Tucked in the shadows, Dr. Silas Marchetti stood like a statue. He gave no help, just leaned against the wall, feverishly wiping a thick, unnatural sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. This wasn't the sweat of a man under pressure. It was the moisture of a man watching a bomb he had planted himself. Silas knew exactly when the timer would hit 0, but the rest were too busy watching the needle to see the killer in the corner. Every eye was locked on the steel tip and the rhythmic beat of Santo's fingers. It was 2:17 in the morning, and in the kitchen downstairs, a delivery girl was about to walk into a slaughterhouse. Killian didn't wait for a medical consensus. He grabbed his phone and barked a freezing order. Lock down the top 10 floors, kill anything that moves, and let no soul in or out. His word was the only law, and here, law was total. Down below, 400 hitmen plugged the exits. The lifts died, and the stairs were chained shut. The skyscraper became a 70-story cage of steel. Every living person inside was now a hostage to Killian's desperation. He put the phone away and stared at his brother's ashen face and tapping hand. Killian saw a pattern that the scientists were blind to, a haunting echo of a ghost he had met once before. He flashed back 17 years to a quiet hospital ward. Killian was only 16 then, a boy forged in blood, sitting by his mother, Margarita. She had been turned into a pale, hollow shell by another man's spite. Organic arsenic had been her end, served in red wine at a rival's dinner. By the time they knew, her organs were already surrendering. He could still smell the lilies and the sterile plastic of that final hour. He remembered the monitor's long, flat scream and how he cried until his throat was raw. Then Santo arrived, 19 years old and carved from stone. No sobbing, no noise, just a brother walking into the wreckage of their lives. Santo had pulled him into a grip so tight it felt like they shared one heart. He whispered a single vow into Killian's ear: never again. That promise became the bricks and mortar of their entire reign. Months later, the family who did it simply ceased to exist. No graves, no evidence. Now, watching Santo's fingers tap, Killian realized the horror had returned. The promise was broken, and the past had come to claim his kin. Killian's knuckles were white as he gripped his gold pistol, tight enough to crack the frame. Blood would flow tonight, he just hadn't found the neck to cut yet. "Easy, Killian," came a voice from the corner, cold as a winter grave. Jude Thorne didn't walk into the light. He allowed himself to be seen. At 62, the longtime counselor to the family was a ghost in broad daylight. He was the man you could sit next to for an hour and never notice until he chose to speak. By the time he spoke, your chances were already gone. Dressed in a perfect gray suit, he leaned on a black cane with a silver head. That cane wasn't for support, it held a 30-centimeter blade, a quiet promise that Jude Thorne always got the final word. His cold gaze moved from Killian to Santo, then drifted over the 15 shaking doctors like wolves watching sheep. At the door stood Declan Voss, a wall of a man. 45 years old and ex-special forces, he carried ghosts from a mission the government had erased. Declan didn't wear a suit for fashion. He was a walking storm of violence that made everyone's skin crawl. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning every 2 seconds, a lethal reflex born from looking for bombs in the dusty streets of Fallujah. He ignored the medical talk, watching only hands and shadows. It was 2:20 in the morning. Santa didn't move, while Dr. Cross held the needle ready. Meanwhile, behind the kitchen door, a pair of hidden eyes watched the whole scene. Those eyes belonged to a woman who had just caught a scent she had spent years trying to bury. 30 minutes before the madness started, Jolene Hadley was sitting in her beat-up truck, her face pale in the blue glow of her phone. A late-night order flashed: 3 expensive steaks and wine for the 67th floor. The tip was $500. She rubbed her eyes. That was 3 nights of back-breaking labor, or a big chunk of the rent she was 3 months behind on. It meant keeping the small studio where little Rosie slept in her mother's bed. It meant keeping the landlord away from their door. Jolene looked at her daughter, curled up under a thin, ragged blanket. The little girl held Mr. Boots, a one-eyed bear with its stuffing coming out. No 4-year-old should be in a truck at 1:30 in the morning, but on the south side, help was $15 an hour. Choosing between a sitter and milk wasn't a choice. It was a slow tragedy. She clicked accept. Steering with one hand, she reached back to check on Rosie. This was her life: prepping food all morning, cleaning offices until 10, then driving until her eyes burned. It was a life built on nothing but exhaustion. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford, with 4 hours being a rare gift. Every dawn, she had to soak her swollen, throbbing hand in scalding water for 10 minutes just to reclaim her grip. At 27, her frame was a map of agony, usually found in someone of 50, and hard labor wasn't the only thing that had broken her. 3 of her ribs had been shattered years ago, not by a collision, but by the hands of Derek Hadley. Her ex, a man who wore a badge, had viciously attacked her while she was 7 months pregnant, his rage fueled by a bottle of whiskey. Back then, a single unwashed dish was enough to make him snap. Jolene had stayed curled on the cold floor, shielding her stomach while Rosie kicked inside her, making a silent vow that he would never touch the child. She kept that promise, escaping to a shelter before scraping together enough for their tiny studio. Derek never bothered to track them down. It wasn't mercy that set her free. It was a wreck that turned his car into a coffin on Interstate 90 at 3 in the morning. The police dismissed it as a mechanical failure. When Jolene heard the news, she didn't cry. There was only a heavy, hollow void where her sorrow should have been. Yet Derek was only a shallow cut compared to her deepest wound. That scar belonged to her father, Raymond Hadley, who vanished without a word years earlier. No farewell, no explanation, just a vacant house and a basement laboratory scrubbed so clean it was as if he had never existed. The investigation went cold after 21 days. As the years crawled by, Jolene eventually stopped calling his dead number. She fought the crushing belief that he simply didn't want the burden of a damaged daughter, that she just wasn't worth the effort of staying. Believing he chose to leave was less painful than the dark alternatives that would have shattered her soul. Now, her old truck idled at the foot of Castellano Tower, 67 floors of cold steel piercing the midnight sky like a jagged blade. She cradled a sleeping Rosie in one arm, while balancing the delivery bags in the other, entering the quiet lobby. A high-speed lift shot her up to the penthouse. When the doors retracted, she found herself standing in the shadow of a man who looked like a fortress. Declan Voss didn't offer a word of welcome. He stood there like a wall of ice, demanding she drop the cargo and show her palms. His voice held the chilling weight of a man who had seen too much death. Jolene did as she was told, pulling her daughter closer to her chest. He rifled through her things and patted her down with the cold precision of a soldier at a border crossing. With a sharp jerk of his thumb, he pointed toward the kitchen. Once she stepped inside and the door nearly latched, a hauntingly familiar scent began to fill the room. It was a fragrance that belonged to a ghost. Jolene carefully laid Rosie on a small sofa, wrapping her in a thin cloth and tucking her teddy bear close. She moved with desperate care, praying the girl wouldn't wake up in this den of predators. When she stood, the aroma hit her again, seeping through the gap in the door. It was faint, like a fading memory, but it was there. Lavender. Yet beneath the floral mask lay something sharper, a bitter, acrid note that only a trained nose would ever detect. Anyone else would have missed it, but Jolene knew better. Through the sliver of the door, she saw Santo's hand twitching against the sheets in a rhythmic pulse. The specialists were caught in a fierce dispute until Killian's low, dangerous voice silenced the room. Jolene wasn't following the fight. Her eyes were locked on the silk draped over Santo's pillow. That fabric was the source of the scent she was pulling apart. Then she saw the cold pot of mint tea sitting nearby, and the pieces finally clicked into place. Seeing that tea sitting next to the scented fabric dragged her mind back 15 years. Suddenly, the penthouse faded away, and she was back in the shadows of her father's basement on the south side, surrounded by the ghosts of his secret experiments. A 12-year-old Jolene sat on a tall stool, her feet swaying in a chilly room that smelled of ancient secrets. Raymond Hadley's workspace didn't have the shine of a modern lab. It was more like a hidden apothecary. Instead of charts, there were jars of dried herbs and leather-bound journals worn thin by his touch. Raymond held 2 glass vials before her. "Close your eyes and focus," he whispered. The girl took a breath. Lavender. He gave her a sad, knowing smile. "Now this one." Jolene inhaled the second scent. It was a perfect twin of the first. "Lavender again?" Raymond shook his head. "No. This is lavender hiding a shadow, grayanotoxin pulled from the heart of a rhododendron. The smell is the same, but there's a ghost of bitterness at the finish, like burnt almonds. A computer would take 40 minutes to see it, but your blood knows it in 2 seconds. Jolene frowned, confused why anyone would wrap poison in flowers. Raymond set the vials down, his eyes heavy with the weight of things he couldn't forget. Because, little one, a true killer never uses what the victim fears. They use what the victim loves, the things they hold close before they sleep. Your nose is the ultimate laboratory. Machines can be tricked, but the senses never lie. 15 years later, in a 67th floor tower, Jolene realized her hand was trembling. The truth struck her like a physical blow. The silk on Santo's bed was drenched in synthetic grayanotoxin, a ghost molecule from honey that no toxicology test would ever find. On its own, breathing it in might cause a racing heart or a dizzy spell, but never death. But the tea on the nightstand, Jolene would bet her life it was spiked with a hint of cesium chloride, a dose so tiny that any blood test would ignore it. Separately, they were harmless, but together they created a lethal reaction that overloaded the vagus nerve, the master switch for the brain and heart. When that nerve is pushed too far, it sends one final silent command to the heart: stop. The heart was perfectly fine, yet the body was being lured into its own demise. This was why 15 top doctors were failing. They were searching for a disease, but they were looking at a work of art in sabotage. This was a cold-blooded execution disguised as a natural collapse. Watching through the door, Jolene saw Dr. Cross reaching for a needle of adrenaline. If that hit his blood, the surge would crash into the nerve's suppression, causing a violent internal explosion instead of a restart. His heart would literally shatter under the strain. They would kill him in their desperate rush to save him, while the person who planned this walked away without a shadow of doubt. Jolene looked back at Rosie, who was dreaming of peace, clutching her toy as her chest moved in a perfect rhythm. If Jolene walked into that room, she would become a target. A delivery girl in a worn uniform had no voice here. One wrong move could mean neither she nor Rosie would ever leave this high-rise sanctuary alive. But if she stayed quiet, the man on that bed would be gone in minutes. She would have to live with that ghost forever, just like the memory of her father, her escape from Derek, and every time she had let fear choke her into silence. With a final glance at her daughter, Jolene stood tall and threw open the door. "If you give him that adrenaline, he'll be dead in 30 seconds. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the medical chaos like a razor through silk, seizing everyone's attention. 15 of the world's best doctors froze. Dr. Cross held the syringe in midair. Killian's hand dropped to his side, and Declan Voss tensed as they all stared at the intruder. They saw a 27-year-old woman in a messy uniform, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, standing there as if she had stepped out of a nightmare. "He is being murdered," Jolene said again, her voice thin but steady. "Right here, while you all watch." A heavy silence followed before Dr. Rajan let out a mocking sneer, the kind of laugh for those who think they are untouchable. "And who are you? Some expert from a search engine?" Jolene didn't blink. She locked eyes with Dr. Cross, the one holding the power to save or kill Santo Castellano in the next half-minute. "That pillow," Jolene said, moving closer. "It's been soaked in lavender, but it's a trap. It's laced with synthetic grayanotoxin from honey. Your screens won't see it because it's been designed to hide from your software. Your machines are hunting for the wrong ghost." The mocking stopped instantly, not because they believed her, but because a courier was speaking the language of a master toxicologist. "The tea," Jolene continued, her mind mapping the room with perfect clarity. "It's spiked with cesium chloride just below the limit. It passes your tests because it doesn't trigger the alarms. On its own, it does nothing. But when he inhales that lavender and sips that tea, the chemicals join forces to seize his vagus nerve. It's sending a kill code straight to his heart." She pointed a finger at the needle in the doctor's shaking hand. "His heart isn't failing. It's being told to quit. If you flood him with adrenaline now, it will cause a total collapse. He will die on this bed, and you will all call it a natural tragedy." The air in that room turned heavy, like a graveyard at midnight. You could hear every mechanical ping and the dull, hollow thumping of a dying heart. Dr. Cross glanced between the woman, the tea, and the bed, caught in the grip of a raw, primal dread. Jolene's voice cut through the silence, desperate. She told her to look at his eyes. "Forget the pupils. Search for the iris tremor, a ghost of a vibration, a rhythmic twitching deep in the eye. That is the only signature this man-made poison leaves behind. If I am wrong, let that needle end it. If I am right, put the death sentence away." Cross searched Meta's face for an answer, but the Titan remained a statue, his stillness a silent, heavy blessing. In this cold world of medicine, when a god stays silent, he is saying yes. Cross pulled her light and moved toward Santo like she was approaching an altar. She pried back the lid and stared. Then, a jagged, broken breath escaped her. The kind of sound a person makes only when they are staring at a miracle or a nightmare. The light meant nothing to the iris. It was shivering. A steady, haunting flutter every 3 seconds, a twin to the twitching of a dead man's fingers. "My God," the doctor breathed, turning toward the stranger. The woman who had mended world leaders looked like a frightened child. She whispered that she was right. That needle of adrenaline slowly descended as the doctor's composure shattered. Meta stepped forward, the color draining from his skin as the truth took hold. All 15 of the world's brightest minds stood there, frozen in the realization that they had almost murdered the very man they were meant to save. Deep in the shadows, Dr. Silas Marchetti went cold. His face turned the color of a bleached skull, looking like a man who had just seen the Reaper step through the door. Jolene was too focused on the life in front of her to notice, but old Jude Thorne was there, his ancient eyes drinking in every single detail. Silence hadn't even found its footing before a cold, gold-etched 9mm pressed against her temple. Killian Castellano didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a low, lethal hum that vibrated straight into her bones. A whisper is the sound of a blade already cutting. He breathed into her ear, demanding to know how a girl like her possessed such dark secrets. Killian leaned closer, his eyes turning into 2 jagged shards of black glass. Jolene felt her pulse hammering against the cold steel of the barrel, a frantic rhythm she was sure he could feel. But she didn't flinch. There was nowhere left to run, just the cold brick and the shadow of a killer. "My father was Raymond Hadley," she said, her voice catching for a second before hardening into iron. She had traded fear for survival a long time ago. He was a ghost, a chemist for the monsters, spending 25 years fixing the bloody messes that the powerful couldn't take to a hospital. He disappeared 4 years ago, leaving nothing behind. From the dark, the rhythmic tap-tap of a black cane on the marble floor signaled Jude Thorne's arrival. He moved with a haunting, theatrical grace, stopping near the machines to study her with eyes that had spent 40 years peeling back the lies of desperate men. "Raymond Hadley," Jude whispered, tasting the name like a long-lost secret. He remembered the man, a brilliant, invisible force, a ghost who vanished 4 summers ago and stayed dead. He looked at Killian and gave a tired command to lower the gun. But the steel stayed right where it was. Killian's eyes moved between the woman, the old man, and his dying brother. When he looked back at Jolene, his gaze had the freezing logic of a beast calculating a debt. If she failed, he warned her, the metal digging into her skin, that death would be a kindness she would never find. "I will start with your daughter while you watch." In that moment, time simply stopped. The mechanical beep of the heart monitor and the doctor's breathing faded into a suffocating void. That horrific promise hung in the air, sharp and bitter, like the smell of gunpowder in a small, closed room. Slowly, Jolene turned, letting the barrel slide across her face until she was staring down the dark throat of the weapon. It was centered perfectly between her eyes. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it came from a ghost, hollow, ancient, and completely devoid of fear. It was the voice of a woman who had been shattered and rebuilt by necessity. She was a survivor with nothing left but the small girl sleeping nearby. "My daughter is 4 years old. She is in your kitchen right now, clutching a one-eyed bear named Mr. Boots, because I am too poor to buy her a new one." Her voice dropped into a terrifying low register. "If you touch my child, I will watch your brother die and feel nothing but peace. I will walk over your body and your 400 men take my daughter and vanish. Then you can tell the kings of Detroit that your brother is rotting because you threatened the only person who could save him." Killian stared, and for the first time in a life made of ash and blood, something inside him shifted. It wasn't fear. He didn't know what that was. It was recognition. He saw a mirror of his own dark soul, The monstrous, absolute devotion one feels for the blood they would die to protect. He remembered 17 years back, his brother holding him on a blood-stained floor, promising they would survive. He saw that same fire in this tired woman. With a sharp mechanical click, Killian snapped the gun down. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice like ice breaking. Jolene finally pulled air into her lungs, a ragged breath, 2 minutes in the making. "I need that kitchen for 7 minutes, and I want my girl up here, away from that truck, right now." She walked into the penthouse kitchen, the sheer wealth of the place making her head spin for a moment. The room was a temple of steel and stone, bigger than her whole apartment. The refrigerators stood like monuments, anchored by granite slabs as thick as a man's chest. This was a place for master chefs, not a woman with shaking hands holding a man's life in her palm. She didn't have time to break. Declan Voss walked in, carrying little Rosie with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man with such violent hands. He laid the sleeping girl down like she was made of thin glass. Jolene was stunned that a murderer could be so soft with a sleeping child. She pressed a fierce kiss to the girl's forehead before her mind locked into a cold, professional gear. She called Bryn Sawyer, her only friend left, a nurse who answered on the second ring at 2:30 in the morning. "Bryn, get to the tower. Rosie is here, and I need you to protect her. Just come." The clock was ticking. Jolene searched the fridge for the pieces of her father's alchemy. She grabbed 6 eggs and separated the whites with the speed of a veteran. 6 clear pools of protein sat in the bowl. The yolks were tossed away like forgotten memories. She ignored the water and went for the high-end filter, tearing it open with a desperate, raw strength. She didn't want the liquid. She wanted the black heart of the machine. She broke the casing and pulled out the block of activated carbon, the only thing that could kill the poison. She grabbed a heavy mortar and began to crush the charcoal. Every strike was rhythmic, a desperate drumbeat as sweat began to sting her eyes. Dr. Cross watched from the doorway, her curiosity finally winning over her shock. She asked softly why she didn't just use the blender. Jolene didn't stop. She explained that the heat from the blades would seal the pores of the carbon, making it useless. This charcoal works because of its tiny surface area. If she melted those pores shut, it would just be black dust. It was the answer of a scientist, cold, hard, and absolute. Dr. Cross stayed quiet, finally seeing the depth of the woman before her. Jolene reached for a $300 jar of honey, something she could never afford for her own child. She added 2 heavy scoops to the egg whites, followed by a stream of the finest olive oil. As she stirred the mixture, she spoke out loud, the chemical formulas acting as an anchor for her shattered nerves. She wasn't explaining it to the doctor. She was reciting the prayers of her father's work to ensure she didn't fail. She whispered that the toxin was a closed loop. This poison rides on blood's fats, recycling through the gut and shocking the nerves over and over. That is why his heart fails in cycles. He isn't just poisoned. He is trapped in a lethal biological loop. She added the black powder to the bowl. Cross looked at the dark sludge, then at the girl, asking where she learned this. The carbon will catch the poison before it can strike again. The egg whites will protect his stomach from the damage, while the honey calms the fire inside. The oil is the messenger, taking the medicine to the exact point of failure. She looked at the medicine, the only hope left for a dying king. That inquiry was a specter that dragged Jolene 13 years into the past. She could practically taste the acrid sulfur and chemicals of her father's subterranean laboratory. She saw the amber flicker of a single bulb and heard the ghost of Raymond's laughter as he filmed her childhood lessons on an ancient grain-filled camcorder. Within her mind, a 14-year-old Jolene stood beside her father, decoding the hidden dialect of acids and bases. Raymond Hadley hadn't just been teaching science, he was arming her for a brutal future, one where the thin line between survival and a cold grave was forged from the secrets he left behind. While the lesson seemed elementary, the weight of Raymond's insight felt tectonic. He spoke in a low, steady hum, a comforting vibration reminding her that chemistry is merely a recipe with lethal stakes. In this world, a single mistake spells total annihilation, while a solitary triumph creates a miracle out of thin air. He promised her domestic talents would eventually become her armor. Back then, a teenage Jolene merely smirked, gripping a simple box of sodium bicarbonate. Now, 13 years later, she is trapped within a tyrant's glass palace, her palms stained as dark as midnight and her sight failing under the pressure of salt and misery. The joy had withered away. She observed the viscous, dark fluid clinging to the glass like heavy ink, ensuring it was thick enough to bond to the stomach's lining. "It's finished," she breathed, entering a ward where 15 world-class surgeons watched her with the terror reserved for a ticking explosive. Dr. Maida stood in her path, dismissing the act as pure insanity, refusing to let a mere delivery girl play God with kitchen scraps. His outcry vanished instantly as a cold, metallic click cut the air. Killian Castellano raised his weapon, his eyes like frozen ice. "The courier is the lead surgeon now," he spat. "Step out of line, and I will paint the wall with your brains." The medic flinched. Jolene moved toward the dying man as another physician threaded a tube through his nose, seeking the gut with a detached professional cruelty that chilled the very air of the room. Jolene's command shattered the tension. "Burn that pillow! He's still suffocating on the venom!" She cast the luxurious purple silk to the floor, propping his head on a cold medical wedge before drawing pitch-black sludge into a massive needle. With a steady, haunting rhythm, she depressed the plunger, sinking every milliliter to the frantic beating in her mind. Fear was a killer. Hesitation was a burial. The black liquid flowed into Santo's frame. A heavy silence descended. 60 seconds ticked by as the monitor showed a heart losing its fight. The surgeons stood like funerary statues, their gazes locked on the jagged electronic pulse. 2 minutes. A freezing shiver raced down Jolene's spine. She had staked her life and her daughter's tomorrow on a kitchen concoction, betting their entire world on the recipe of a dead man. Failure meant she would never feel her child's warmth again. 3 minutes of a crushing, hollow silence followed, pierced only by the machine's rhythmic mechanical chirps. Killian loomed over his brother's bed, a shadow cast across a world that seemed to have stopped rotating entirely. His jaw was a ridge of rigid agony. The weapon was gone. In its place, he held Santo's hand with the raw desperation of a lost child. It was the same way he had gripped their mother's hand 17 years ago, standing in a dim hospital corridor before the lights went out forever. Dr. Cross searched Jolene's face for hope, but found only a cold command to stay the course. 5 minutes. Then the atmosphere shifted, a faint quickening, a surge of vital energy that made the doctor gasp as the erratic lines on the screen began to find a steady path. It felt as if a flickering flame had been shielded from the wind. A solid pulse returned. Dr. Mehta leaned in, eyes darting between the monitor and the patient. The violent tremors had faded, replaced by a profound stillness resting within Killian's desperate grasp. By the 6-minute mark, the heartbeat found its soul. The digital peaks rose with newfound strength. The ghostly gray hue of Santo's skin began to vanish, like the morning fog lifting off a frozen shoreline as the first rays of a brutal sun break through the horizon. Jude Thorne ignored the blinking lights, fixated only on the girl. Behind his stony mask, a sliver of true disbelief surfaced, a rare crack in 40 years of absolute dominance. 7 minutes had passed, and the cadence of life was finally holding its ground against the dark. 62 beats every 60 seconds. Blood pressure sitting at 90/60, fragile but breathing. The surgeon checked the patient's eyes. The convulsions had stopped. She looked at Jolene, her expression filled with a haunting reverence that would follow the young woman into every shadow she ever walked. Respect was paid in silence. Suddenly, Santo's eyelids flickered. His steely eyes were exhausted, but burning with a sharp, returning fire. He scanned the sterile room, looking past the doctors and his brother until his gaze finally anchored onto the stranger standing in the shadows. He looked at the broken girl in the tattered uniform, her hair a tangled mess and her skin stained with the soot of labor. Amidst the sea of pristine white coats, she appeared like a smudge of charcoal on a clean sheet. "Who?" he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "Who are you?" he demanded. Jolene stood there, drained and trembling, having just wrestled the Reaper, using nothing but household staples. This king of the abyss spoke with the chilling arrogance of a man who only asked for a name if he intended to erase it from existence. "Just the help," she answered with a cold edge. "Your meal is a loss, and you still owe me for the mess." Santo Castellano, whose very breath could silence a city, let out a dry, rattling laugh. It was a sound so alien it felt like a miracle. Killian stood frozen in shock. He hadn't witnessed his brother's smile in an age. As Jolene turned to leave, her eyes snagged on the discarded silk near the mattress. Something about that fabric triggered a primal instinct, pulling her back into a web of dark secrets. As the adrenaline ebbed, she spotted the one clue the professionals missed. She turned over the corner of the lavender silk. There, stitched into the fibers, were 2 tiny hand-sewn initials, P and C. Jolene recognized the delicate touch of a human spirit behind the needle. Years of toil in Chinatown had taught her to distinguish a machine's stitch from a soul's signature. Someone had branded this cloth with their identity. Realizing who those initials belonged to sent a killing frost through her veins. She was drowning in a world deeper than she ever feared. 3 days later, she was back on her knees, the grease, scrubbing the life from her bones. Her manager, Carmine, who looked away as if she were a plague, forced her to work late over a minor spill. Every muscle screamed with the ghost of her exhaustion. She bore the weight in total silence. Quiet was the currency of survival for a mother with no other options. She tried to convince herself the night in the penthouse was a feverish nightmare and that the shadow of a golden gun had finally faded into the past. She attempted to bury those 2 letters, P and C, knowing that to remember them was to step back into the mouth of the beast. She wanted Rosie to hold a pen, not a trigger. But some ghosts are too heavy to stay buried in the dirt. The scream of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet afternoon. Jolene kept her head down, assuming it was just another client. But the heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather on the tile announced that the devil had come to collect his due. Declan Voss towered over her, his shadow swallowing the light. He was a monument of gray wool and unspoken violence. "This isn't an invitation," his gaze screamed. "The master wants a word," he said aloud, his voice as unyielding as a slab of iron. Jolene stood, her bones clicking under the strain. "No," she said with a finality that surprised her. Declan didn't argue. He simply turned to the curb and opened the heavy door of a black behemoth, waiting for her to submit to the inevitable. The sight through the tinted glass sent a wave of absolute horror through Jolene's soul. There sat Rosie, perched on ivory leather like a tiny queen, her little legs swinging in the air. She was covered in expensive green gelato, hugging her toy, and glowing with a joy that suggested she had found paradise. A container of artisan ice cream sat beside her, the kind from the Gold Coast that cost $200. It was a luxury Jolene couldn't provide in 1,000 lifetimes. A paralyzing numbness spread through her chest as the truth hit. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was a display of infinite reach. They had simply picked up her daughter, fed her sweets, and strapped her into $1 million coffin as if it were just another Tuesday. That casualness was the true horror, a silent declaration that her child was never truly safe. Jolene felt the crushing weight of her own powerlessness. The girl waved, her voice bright through the glass, gushing about the treats the driver gave her. Jolene forced a hollow mask of a smile, burying the scream in her throat to protect her daughter from the terror. She pulled the child into her chest, holding her with a suffocating intensity, before entering the plush, silent interior. Not a single word was wasted on Declan during the long drive. 40 minutes later, the massive car rolled through the iron gates of the Castellano stronghold in Illinois. Jolene had seen palaces in movies, but the scale of this stone monster took her breath away. The estate held 30 rooms and 5 acres of manicured chaos, with ancient trees standing like guards along the path. Layers of invisible eyes watched every shadow across the rolling emerald fields. Upon seeing the gardens, the 4-year-old let out a high-pitched cry of pure wonder, the sound of a girl who had spent her life trapped by concrete. She ran onto the grass, her toy trailing behind. The study was a tomb of dark oak and heavy silence. There he sat, Santo Castellano, a king reigning from the shadows, his silhouette sharp and his posture like iron. Though his skin bore the pale ghost of the toxin, those flinty gray eyes had regained their predatory hunger, the kind of gaze that could strip a man's soul bare in a single heartbeat. Beside him, Jude Thorne stood like a statue, one hand resting on a dark cane. Santo breathed a single cold command. Sit. Jolene fell into the chair, her muscles screaming after 4 hours of scrubbing floors on her knees. Without a flicker of warmth, he laid out his terms, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who didn't recognize the word no. He offered $50,000 every month, a sanctuary within his stone walls, a future for Rosie, and a seat as his lead consultant. Jolene just stared. That sum was a mountain of gold, more than her 3 jobs could ever scrape together in a year. It meant a real bed for her girl and the medical care they'd been forced to pray for. It meant finally more than 4 hours of sleep. Still, she shook her head. She whispered her wish to stay clean of his blood-stained world. Santo didn't even blink. He simply watched her with the cold curiosity of a grandmaster evaluating a lonely pawn. You're already drowning in the deep, he told her. The moment she decoded those initials on the fabric, the PC, the die was cast and her path was carved in stone. He leaned forward, his voice vibrating with a new, hollow darkness. He spoke the brutal truth. The ghost who tried to kill him knew her face. Did she really think her rotting apartment with its broken locks and dark hallways was any place to guard a small child? Jolene fell silent, choked by the bitter poison of knowing he was right. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where Rosie was a blur of motion against the grass, her laughter seemingly cutting through the thick glass. For once in her short life, the girl had room to breathe without hitting a wall. It was a tragedy. The very man Jolene feared most was the one erasing the scars of their poverty. Turning back to the predator in his den, Jolene set her own price. Santo tilted his head, a lethal ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was unheard of to barter with a Castellano. Usually those who tried ended up as part of the city's foundation. Yet, she stood her ground in the heart of the storm. "I will find your killer," she promised, "but only if you find my father, Raymond Hadley, who vanished 4 years ago." She knew the underworld held the keys to his cage. Santo weighed her heart in a heavy silence that lasted 10 long seconds. After a subtle nod from his advisor, the devil took the deal. With a single word, the blood pact was sealed. There was no paper, just the terrifying weight of bartering with a monster for her daughter's future. During that first week in the gilded cage, Peace became a stranger, leaving her staring at the ceiling for all but 3 hours of the night. Her mattress was a $40,000 masterpiece, yet it brought her no rest. She was haunted by the absence of the city's rot. She missed the chaotic music of the South Side, the wailing sirens and the pulsing bass of street life that had always been her only lullaby. Here, the silence felt like a shroud. The stillness of the manor was so deep she could hear the rhythmic breathing of her daughter in the next room. It was the first time Rosie had a kingdom of her own. Sleeping on linens so soft, Jolene found herself checking the tags. Unable to understand such luxury, the child adjusted with a heartbreaking ease, spending her days learning the names of lilies from the house staff. Watching from the shadows, Jolene felt a fracture in her chest. She was drowning in love for her girl's joy, yet paralyzed by the dark debt that had bought this happiness. Unseen, Santo was always there, a phantom observer. He tracked their every move through the flickering screens on his desk. In the hollow hours of the morning, he watched through the darkness as Jolene sat on the floor, tending to her child with a fierce, quiet devotion his world had never known. He watched her check the warmth of the milk against her skin with a doctor's precision before letting the girl drink. He listened to the weary, rasping lullabies Jolene sang at night, nameless tunes that acted like a physical weight, pulling the child into dreams within 2 minutes. It was a tenderness that felt alien to his soul. Santo had never touched such raw gentleness. His own mother's love had been a shield of war, and his father had replaced bedtime stories with the cold weight of firearms. To see a woman sacrifice her pride and her safety just to sing a quiet song to a child at 10 in the evening, it disturbed him deeply. This glimpse of humanity left him pacing, unable to look away from a life so different from his own. On the 8th night, Jolene's survival instincts finally took the wheel. Once the child was deep in sleep, she retreated into the digital shadows, firing up the battered laptop she had rescued from her old life. The machine was a relic that groaned like a jet engine, but it was her only blade. She had spent 3 years learning the language of code through online tutorials because she couldn't afford $75 for a repairman. Those desperate lessons had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple hardware fixes. She knew how to swim through the invisible veins of a network. Despite the fortress-grade security, a single lapse, perhaps a mistake by the security chief, had left a backup drive exposed. Jolene wasn't a professional ghost. She was just a desperate mother who knew exactly where the secrets were buried. Deep within a hidden file for regional eyes, she found it. A grainy, distant shot of a man trapped in a sterile white hell. He was a shell of his former self, his hair turned to ash and his face carved with trauma. His hand was chained to a cold metal workbench. The glass and steel surrounding him were all too familiar to her eyes. It was Raymond Hadley, her father, captured only 3 weeks ago. When Jolene shut the lid, her bones began to rattle. She had to squeeze her own hands for 10 seconds just to keep from falling apart before she found the strength to walk. She moved through the lightless halls like a phantom, throwing open the study door without a word. Santo sat in the amber glow of a single lamp, a glass of dark spirits in his hand. He didn't flinch. His expression suggested he'd been counting the minutes until she finally came for him. "You've known he was alive this whole time." Santo set his glass down with a heavy thud. "Sit! Don't you dare tell me what to do. Give me the truth." Santo stared at her, finally offering a slow, weighted nod. "Your father is a prisoner. The Ferraros have him locked in a hellhole in Gary, Indiana." Cristiano Ferraro snatched him 4 years ago to bridge a gap in their chemical war. They've forced him to brew that synthetic toxin, the same one that nearly buried me last week. My scouts found him 90 days ago, but I couldn't move. With the traitor watching us, a rescue would have been his execution. They won't keep him as a pet again. They will kill him. Jolene stood frozen, every word feeling like a lead weight dropped onto her ribs. He hadn't left her. He was stolen. For 4 years, she had nursed a bitter hatred for a ghost. 4 years of telling little Rosie that Grandpa had just gone away because she didn't have the heart to say he'd walked out. And through those years, my father was in chains, brewing the very death he once taught me to recognize by scent. You knew, and you stayed silent. Her voice began to rattle, fueled by a searing heat rising from her chest. He is being dismantled while you sit here, sipping top-shelf whiskey and hoarding your little secrets. If I had told you, Santo countered, his voice a flat line, even as his eyes burned. You would have run to Gary that same night with nothing but a death wish. You would be dead. And if you're gone, who is left to save me next time? Stop making my tragedy about your survival, she hissed. Jolene lunged forward, closing the space until they were barely inches apart. You didn't trap me here for my medical mind. You kept me because you were terrified. The word afraid seemed to freeze the air. Usually calling Santo Castellano a coward was a death sentence, but the rage never came. The silence just deepened. He rose with a slow, predatory grace and seized her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He pulled her into his space until she could feel the heat of his breath and the scent of wood and scotch clinging to his suit. His steel-gray eyes searched hers, stripped of the cold stone mask he usually wore. There was a flicker of something raw in his gaze, a vulnerability he hadn't realized he had until this very second. Suddenly, he let her go, as if her skin were white-hot iron. He stepped back, turning his eyes to the shadows as his hand tightened into a fist. Go to bed, Jolene, he rasped. Tomorrow we bring him home. She stood there for 3 long seconds before retreating, leaning against the cold hallway wall as the door clicked shut. Her wrist still hummed where he had touched her. By morning, she was at the small desk in her room, staring at a blank sheet of paper before carving 2 letters. PC. For 40 years, Phoebe Castellano let a bitter truth fester like an open wound. She was the forgotten daughter, a ghost born of a marriage the old man tried to erase. Living on the edge of the empire, she could smell the blood and gold, but never touch it. When the king died, the crown bypassed her for the golden son, Santo. Phoebe simply withdrew into the ledger books, hiding behind a mask of clerical perfection. She managed billions in total silence, a ghost empty vault that no one bothered to suspect. Jolene needed more than a hunch. She needed blood on the hands. For 72 hours, she trailed the sister like a phantom. Every Wednesday at 2, a black car whispered out at the gates, Phoebe claiming she was heading to the main office for a routine check. That Wednesday, Jolene lied to Rosie about a supply run and shadowed the Mercedes into the city. There was no office visit. Instead, Phoebe stopped at a high-end gallery where the art cost more than most people's lives. It was a playground for the elite. From a block away, Jolene watched through the glass. Phoebe was whispering with a woman in blood-red silk, a woman whose smile was as cold as old money. It was Gianna Ferraro, the daughter of the monster who held Jolene's father in a cage. The betrayal was etched in digital pixels on Jolene's phone. It was the ultimate sin. Phoebe was selling out every one of Santo's secrets to the Ferraros. In return, they would pave her path to the throne once her brother was buried 6 feet deep. That monogrammed cloth wasn't an accident. It was a signature of her cruelty. Phoebe wanted her name on the blade. While she plotted, Killian was squeezing Silas Marchetti, the doctor whose courage had failed him the very night the boss nearly met his end. Killian didn't need data. He just needed a heavy gun and a dark room. Every man finds his voice when steel is pressed against his teeth. The truth was ugly. Silas had taken $250,000 from a Ferraro front over 6 months. The doctor didn't use a knife to kill. He just prescribed tea for rest and silk for comfort. He didn't have to strike the blow. He just had to leave the gates open for the venom. That night, Jolene sat alone, lost in an old video. It was a hazy memory from 4 years ago, filmed in the golden glow of her father's lab. Raymond was guiding his 13-year-old girl, his hands steady and sure. When the chemicals turned blue, their shared laughter was the sound Jolene still carried in her chest. "My girl is a true scientist," Raymond's voice echoed like a ghost from a better life. Jolene paused the clip, crying without a sound. She compared that vibrant man to the broken, skeletal figure in the leaked photos. She had mastered the art of silent grief long ago. Then, a floorboard groaned. Little Rosie stood in the doorway, clutching a one-eyed bear named Mr. Boots. "Does it hurt, Mommy?" she whispered. Jolene tried to scrub the sorrow from her face, but the child's eyes saw right through the mask of strength. "I'm fine, honey," but Rosie knew better. She crawled into bed and pressed the toy against Jolene's chest. "Mr. Boots will carry the sadness for you." As the child slept, Jolene held her and the bear, finally letting a ragged, broken sob escape into the dark. Out in the hallway shadows, Santo stood like a statue. He'd heard the child stir and stopped. Through the sliver of the door, he witnessed the raw weight of a mother's devotion. For a heartbeat, he wasn't a killer. He was a boy watching his own mother. Margarita had held him just like that before the poison stole her breath. She had whispered her love in a tone that was now fading like a ghost in the fog. He turned away, his fists white-knuckled and tight enough to crush bone as he vanished. Clinging to her daughter, Jolene let out a soft, fractured cry, a tiny sound that filled the empty room. In the corridor, Santo Castellano was frozen. He had been passing when the hinges creaked. Through the light, he saw the bear, the tears, and his own childhood. It was exactly how Margarita cradled him before the venom took hold. She'd whispered secrets of love, but that melody was a ghost he could no longer catch. He drifted back into the gloom, his fists clenched into ivory stones against the weight of the dark. A quiet exit left only a steaming cup and a nameless note on her desk. "We will find," it promised. But as she crawled through the server's digital graveyard, the warmth of the tea died. A new chill settled deep within her bones, cold and relentless. Her digital life wasn't hers alone. For 7 days, a shadow had tracked every click and every secret. The trail stopped at Jude Thorne. 40 years of loyalty to the family, yet he was haunting her. Was he her savior or just another warden? At 6 in the morning, the library was a tomb of dust. Jude sat unmoving, his cane leaning nearby as the tea sent gray ribbons into the air. He didn't blink when she entered. He'd probably tracked her heartbeat from the moment she woke up. "You were lurking," she hissed, her hands shaking with rage. She struggled for control, though the anger in her jaw felt like it might snap. "For 7 days, you watched my father suffer and saw Phoebe's treason, yet you chose to say absolutely nothing." Jude took a measured sip, his eyes reflecting 3 generations of Castellano blood. "My eyes are for Santo," he said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I wasn't protecting him from you, Jolene. I was protecting him from the chaos of your own recklessness. A solo raid on Gary, Indiana, would have been your funeral. Ferraro would have executed your father the moment you touched the door. You'd be buried with the proof." The urge to scream at him was there, but the cold logic of his words cut deep. "Then prove where your loyalty lies," she challenged softly. After a long 5-second silence, Jude pulled a folded map from his pocket. He laid it down like a peace treaty. It held coordinates for Industrial Way, the black heart of the Ferraro's dark operation. 4 guards outside, 2 in the hall, and a 3-story drop to the lab. Your father's at the bottom. She took the paper with trembling hands. "Why tell me?" "Because Santo calculates until the chance dies. He would leave your father in chains for another day. You, however, are out of patience. And tonight, that is exactly what we need." Finding Killian was easy. After 10, he was always at the range, firing until the ghost of his brother vanished and the tremors in his hands finally stopped for a while. She laid out the truth: Silas, Ferraro, and her father, hiding only the memory of Santo's hand on her skin. Killian loaded a fresh magazine, his answer short and sharp. "What time?" By 3, they reached a skeletal warehouse in Gary, a place of rusted industrial ghosts. To a stranger, it was just another decaying factory. But Jolene saw the hidden eyes, cameras in the street lamps, modern vents on the roof, and fresh tire marks in the mud. It was a fortress of steel dressed up like a graveyard of industry. Killian moved with the cold grace of a man raised to kill. The outer guards fell like falling leaves, and the men inside never even touched their radios. As they descended into the black throat of the stairs, the air turned sour with industrial poisons. Down on the floor, the smell hit her. A twisted version of her father's old lab, now rotted and foul. There sat Raymond Hadley, a ghost of a man with 40 pounds of life stripped away. He was chained to a table that served as his cage. His hair was stark white, his face a map of hollow scars and sharp bone. A silver line of trauma traced his arm. When he looked up, the warmth she loved was gone, replaced by an exhaustion so deep he thought she was just a dream. "This place is a graveyard for the living," he croaked, his throat sounding like rusted iron. Jolene collapsed, staring at the heavy shackles and the 20 years of misery carved into his face during 4 short summers. She finally let out the scream she'd held for 1,460 days. "You vanished without a single goodbye. I assumed you'd finally let me fade away." Raymond's eyelids shuddered as salt-streaked tears found the deep canyons of his new wrinkles. "The Ferraro family demanded I cook their poison. When I said no, they crushed 3 of my fingers into dust." He displayed a hand where the bones had mended into a gnarled, useless knot. Then they flashed pictures of you and the little girl on South Ashland. It was simple. labor for them or bury my family. I chose the chains. I cooked their filth, but laced every gram with failure, dancing on a razor's edge of betrayal until they finally caught the scent. She embraced him, but he only breathed a name that made her pulse turn to frost. Derek, he sighed. You tasked him with tracking me, didn't you? Jolene stiffened. He found me, but he kicked a nest of vipers. He pried into secrets that the Ferraro bloodline would kill to keep hidden. They ended him. That inferno on Interstate 90 wasn't some fluke. It was a professional execution. The truth was a crushing weight. Her own desperate search had signed Derek's death warrant. She wanted to weep for her child's father, but the massive scale of the treachery left her soul cold and hollow. On that frozen concrete, her reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. Suddenly, a high-pitched wail cut through the dark. The alarm. Scarlet lights washed the corridor in the hue of fresh blood, a screaming reminder that their borrowed time had just run out. We have 2 minutes before they swarm us, Killian bellowed. Jolene hacked through the metal restraints and pulled her father to his feet. Despite his failing body, Raymond lunged for the computer, ripping a drive from its slot. Take this, he panted. The formulas, the payoff, the proof of Ferraro's lapdogs is right here. It was my life insurance in case I never breathed fresh air again. Killian appeared from the shadows, his shoulder soaked in a blooming stain of crimson. A bullet had torn through him, yet his grip never faltered. He fired twice into the gloom, answered only by the dull crash of a body hitting the floor. Move! Killian's voice was a crack of thunder. Jolene dragged her father toward the exit, his shaking frame leaning heavily on her as they fought for air. Behind them, Killian was a bleeding wall of defiance, his barrel tracking every shadow, leaving a trail of his own life on the stairs. They lunged into the biting night air, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in their ears. Killian drove with one hand, his other pressed against his mangled shoulder as the engine screamed. In the back, Raymond gripped Jolene's hand tight. Forgive me, he whispered. Santo knew about this the whole time. Whether the traitor was Declan, Jude, or some ghost in the machine, she couldn't say. But when she pulled into the driveway at 5 a.m, smelling of gunpowder and sewage, she found Santo waiting in the foyer like an ancient, silent judge. He scanned the broken remains, the shattered father, the wounded brother, and the woman who had defied him. Total silence. Jolene steeled herself for the impact. She had played the Midwest's most dangerous man for a fool. In their world, such a gamble usually ends with a shovel and a hole. Santo was terrifyingly composed. He reached out and plucked the drive from her fingers, his cold, silver eyes boring into her soul for a long heartbeat. Next time, I want the truth from the start, he said quietly. He turned to his men. Get a doctor for Killian and open the master suite for Mr. Hadley. No screaming followed, no blood was shed, but Jolene knew she'd crossed a line where others only find a grave. For the next 48 hours, the house felt like a tomb, while Santo and Jude stayed behind locked doors. Declan stood guard, a silent wall of iron that even the closest allies couldn't pass. When the doors finally creaked open, Santo surfaced with a plan that Jolene only understood in terrifying bits and pieces. Phoebe had already set the stage. A high-stakes meeting at the manor for that very evening, gathering 7 underworld kings from Chicago to New York, including the monstrous Cristiano Ferraro. To the world, they were meeting to judge Santo's fitness to lead. In truth, it was Phoebe's coronation, a play to steal the crown with Ferraro's help. Santo saw every trap on the board, yet instead of running, he let the storm break at 7 o'clock that night. The ballroom was a cathedral for dark oaths. Around a 20-seat oak table, white candles wept wax onto the grain, while red wine shimmered like blood in the glass. Light poured from above like a golden shroud over 7 masters of crime, each one surrounded by a phalanx of silent killers. At the head of the table, facing Santo's empty chair, sat 50-year-old Cristiano Ferraro, his silver hair sharp and his smile cold. Beside the vacant throne stood Phoebe in a black mourning dress, her glass steady, wearing the look of victory she had been dreaming of for 40 years. We all see how Santo has weakened. As the family's mind and voice, I propose that... Her sentence froze as the heavy doors swung wide. The sound of heels on the wood was like a hammer on a coffin. Santo Castellano walked into the light, dressed in a sharp 3-piece suit looking like a god of vengeance. Though his skin was pale as a ghost's, his back was as straight as a sword, and his gray eyes scanned the room with the peace of a reaper. Jude Thorne walked behind him, his cane tapping a rhythmic warning, while Declan Voss followed with a hand buried deep in a pocket, clutching cold steel. Phoebe's mask fell apart. Her hand shook, spilling a single drop of wine onto the wood like a fresh wound. Cristiano's smile simply vanished, a quiet admission that he'd played his hand too early. "Santo," he murmured with a stiff nod. "Nobody expected you to be on your feet today." "Expectations are just another word for failure," Santo countered, taking his seat with a terrifying slow grace. He locked eyes with Cristiano. "That is the mistake people make when they think my silence means I am broken." He then tilted his head toward the high gallery overlooking the table. Jolene stepped out at the velvet shadows above. To her left was Raymond, thin and scarred, but standing with a fire that 4 years in a cage couldn't kill. On her right was Killian, his shoulder wrapped in white linen stained with dried blood, his presence heavy and dangerous. A gold-plated pistol rested in Killian's hand, pointed toward the floor. Without a word, Jolene tapped a screen, and the 4 massive monitors meant for Phoebe's victory suddenly flared to life. They weren't showing a transfer of power. They were playing a symphony of her sins. The first screen exposed Phoebe's treachery. $2 million moved into Cayman accounts owned by Ferraro's shell companies. Her own signature the evidence. The second screen flickered with grainy footage of Raymond Hadley, a ghost in rusted chains, forced to brew death in concrete hole. His hollow eyes seemed to look through the screen at his captors. The third display showed the chemistry of the toxin, covered in Raymond's hidden notes of sabotage. Finally, the fourth monitor revealed the $250,000 paid to the doctor, alongside the digital orders to poison Santo's lungs. "These are lies," Phoebe wailed, her voice sounding like breaking glass. "It's all a setup. Cristiano and this girl are trying to frame me, Santo." The room went silent. In her panic, she had used his first name, a slip of familiarity that proved her secret bond with the man trying to kill her brother. The slip-up hung in the air like a hangman's rope. Cristiano Ferraro sat perfectly still, not moving a muscle, but for the first time in 5 decades, a single drop of sweat rolled down his face. In their world, that one bead carried more weight than 1,000 death warrants. Santo stood up, his footsteps sounding like a funeral bell as he walked around the table. He stopped right behind Phoebe. "You always wanted this chair," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft and tender. "In the Castellano house, a whisper like that is far more terrifying than a scream of rage. But you forgot that this throne is built on the bones of traitors." Suddenly, the room vanished into total blackness. It wasn't an accident. It was an eclipse. Darkness fell like a heavy blanket, followed by the soft, clinical rhythm of silenced shots. Killian's ghosts, with the eyes of wolves, moved through the void. When the lights returned 10 seconds later, Ferraro's guards were bound on the floor in plastic ties. Cristiano sat like a statue made of ash. Phoebe was collapsed on the cold floor, her hands tied and her dress ruined. The smile she'd worn for 40 years, replaced by a mask of pure, naked terror. 7 men sat in a tomb of silence, realizing this wasn't some petty coup, it was a final judgment. Santo's gaze drifted toward the gallery, finding his silent jurors in Jolene, Raymond, and Killian. The tablet's cold blue glow washed over the girl who had shattered his world. With a nearly imperceptible tilt of his head, Santo offered a heavy, wordless gratitude, the ghost of a thanks. Then Jolene's phone vibrated like a dying pulse. 4 words from Bryn turned her blood to frozen slush. Rosie is burning up. Hospital, the Empire of Kings, vanished in a heartbeat. Jolene said nothing as she dropped the tablet and descended the stairs, ghosting past the wreckage of Phoebe and Cristiano. She cut through the tactical noise and the sea of killers like a woman driven by a haunting, singular fire. She threw herself into her rusted-out truck, a jagged relic among the gleaming silver, and tore out of the estate. No one dared to cross her path. Perhaps they sensed the terrifying, ancient power of a mother whose child was hanging in the balance. Stroger Hospital stood like a sterile fortress under the hum of fluorescent lights at 10 o'clock at night. Jolene raced through the halls, her skin still stained with the filth of a secret laboratory. She looked like a soldier of war stumbling into a sanctuary of peace. Outside room 412, Bryn stood trembling with a cold coffee in her hand. "Just an ear infection," she whispered to kill the panic. "She's recovering, but the poor thing called for you until her little voice simply gave out." Stepping inside, Jolene saw how tiny Rosie looked, swallowed by those clinical white sheets. Her skin was flushed, her breathing ragged with the exhaustion of a fever. Tucked beneath the wires was Mr. Boots, the only silent guardian she had left. Jolene drifted toward the plastic chair, moving like a shadow to keep the peace, but the child's eyes opened at once, as if her soul knew its home. That tiny mama was a fragile thread of sound. Jolene pulled her close, letting her own scent become the girl's only refuge. She sat there, pinned down by the heavy weight of her own history. She looked at the hands now stroking her daughter's hair, the same fingers that had ground charcoal into medicine and bled over keyboards. These palms had dragged her father through the fire of a warehouse. These hands had torn down the powerful and stopped a massacre from the shadows. Now they were occupied with the quiet, agonizing task of cooling a 4-year-old's brow. Maybe this was their only true calling, not the shedding of blood, but the soft touch of mercy. 40 minutes passed before Raymond stepped into the light, wearing nothing but a borrowed suit and 4 years of trauma. He froze at the door, watching his daughter hold the child. Those eyes, once hardened by poison and formulas, finally broke and flooded with salt. The little one looked up, locking eyes with the ghost in the doorway. She clutched her toy and waited for her mother's nod before whispering, "Are you Grandpa?" In that second, the man's iron walls shattered like glass under the weight of 4 years of silence. He sobbed, the ragged, hollow grief of a 58-year-old who had sacrificed his very soul for their safety. The old photograph proved he still existed in their hearts. Jolene reached out, pulling the broken man toward the bed to let his spirit finally rest. The child held out her stuffed rabbit, her most sacred treasure, as a silent peace offering to the weeping man. 3 generations huddled together on that narrow cot, the grandfather's scarred arm wrapped around them like a shield against the dark. For the first time in 4 years, the world felt right. As midnight drew near, Jolene's rough voice began a jagged lullaby. Raymond sat with his eyes squeezed shut, drinking in the sound like a man dying of thirst in a wasteland. Clear's throat. A shadow lingered in the sterile hall beyond the glass. Santo Castellano stood alone, no soldiers, just a man in black leaning against the cold. He watched the portrait of a family through the window, the mother's song and the old man's return. He watched them like a starving beggar outside a feast. His own mother was a ghost by the time he was 19, and his father had taught him that love was a lethal weakness. No one had ever hummed to him in the blackness of the night. That 30-room mansion had always been a grave, never a home. He turned to walk away, but the door creaked. Jolene was there, her clothes caked in the day's grime, her eyes sharp with exhaustion. "Are you going to stand guard out here until the sun rises?" she asked. Santo looked past her to the sleeping child and the old man. "I don't know what my place is inside that room," he confessed. A rare moment of honesty in 36 years. Jolene's voice was a soft mercy. "Just sit down and be quiet. That's plenty." He stepped inside, settling onto a rigid plastic chair that felt more foreign than any throne. In the quiet, the feverish girl shifted, her tiny fingers tangling around his hand. It was a simple search for warmth from a soul who knew nothing of his crimes. "You have such big hands," the child murmured into her dreams. Santo stared at the hand that had signed death warrants and snuffed out lives. Now it was a prisoner to 5 small fingers that felt no fear of the blood staining his skin. He didn't move. The king of the underworld sat in a public ward, held captive by a child until dawn. 2 weeks later, at the Lake Forest estate, the sunset bled violet across the Illinois sky as if the light was mourning the end of the day. Below the terrace, Rosie was a blur of mud and joy, teasing her grandfather for planting the mint upside down. Raymond let out a laugh, a beautiful rusty sound from a man who had forgotten how. Covered in dirt, he finally began to see the light. With fingers twisted by the hands of his torturers, Raymond carefully pressed the herbs into the earth. He kept the secret to himself. That mint was the first thing he'd taught his daughter 20 years ago. Some memories are best left to the wind. High above, Jolene swirled a glass of red wine, her gaze fixed on the garden. She took small sips, wondering why this vintage tasted so different from the bitter bottles of her past. In this place, even the air felt like a gift she hadn't quite earned. Santo stood silently beside her, his whiskey catching the embers of the sun. He watched her the way a man watches the horizon, trying to memorize the light without losing his sight. The silence between them was the heavy peace of 2 survivors of the same wreckage. "A quiet life is a foreign language to me," Santo whispered, his voice a low vibration against the skyline. In his world, showing your heart was a death sentence, but here, under the dying light, he let the mask slip just an inch. "You're not alone in that," Jolene said, never looking away from the child. She remembered the years of drowning in exhaustion and the rusted-out truck. She gave him a tired, honest look. Peace was always a luxury we couldn't afford to buy. Silence settled over them, broken only by the laughter below as the child chased a man pretending to be afraid of a worm. Their joy was a sharp blade against the 2 broken souls on the balcony. Santo looked at her, and the predator was nowhere to be found. There was no king here, no executioner, just a 36-year-old man who had never heard his mother sing. He stood there, aching for a connection he didn't have the words to name. "Stay," he whispered, not a command, but the raw, naked sound of a plea. Jolene met his eyes, her voice steady. Is that an order from the throne, or are you actually asking me? Santo didn't speak. He watched a single oak leaf dance across the stone until it touched her feet, the silence nearly breaking under his heavy hesitation. At last, words escaped him, drifting like shadows in the dusk. The heavy gates of his heart finally creaked open, surrendering a plea he had spent decades burying. In all my years, he whispered, I have never needed someone until now. Jolene stayed silent, letting her glass go cold as she reached for him. Her skin was rough, marked by the grind of the road and the weight of hard work. The same fingers that once mixed a prayer in a pot now traced the wounds of a titan. A man who lived by the blade, yet had spent 12 hours being a pillow for a terrified 4-year-old. Under the dying light of the windy city, two vastly different worlds collided on a simple bench. The air carried the echoes of a child giggling at her messy grandfather. Jolene didn't arrive with sirens or bodyguards. She lacked the golden ticket to his ivory tower. She just showed up in a rusted pickup with some lukewarm takeout and a sleeping toddler holding a broken doll. She mended what 15 top doctors couldn't touch, succeeding only because she understood the perspective of the broken, who still believe in miracles. Her gift wasn't just survival, it was the desire to actually live. The real magic wasn't in that medicinal brew, but in the collision of a man who missed out on affection and a woman who had only known heartbreak, both choosing to try again together. We learn here that history isn't changed by just the elite or the mighty. Usually it is the invisible ones, the exhausted mother surviving on 4 hours of sleep who still finds a lullaby for her baby, despite her throat aching from the day. Real strength lives in the soul that won't break even when the world pushes back. If this story of fire and silent agony moved you, please show your support and send this to someone you hold dear. Join our community so we can keep these late-night talks alive. I'm curious about what resonated with you. Which moment hit home? Share your reflections below, for a narrative only truly lives when it is passed from one heart to another. May you find wellness, purpose, and a serene heart in the days to come. I appreciate you sharing the darkness with me. Rest easy, and I will be waiting for you in our next chapter.